something called class reductionism, the idea that there were people out there who were just so blindly socialist and blindly economically fixated that they were diminishing, ignoring, or somehow denying even the other forms of racism, gender bias, and other kinds of bigotry in this country. And I wondered about that because I don't know any of those people. And my next guest, who has for many years been a professor studying the intersection of race and politics in this country, has written a piece called The Myth of Class Reductionism. Adolph Reed Jr. is very well known in this area.
Here are the tropes of Adolph Reed. He denies the existence of class reductionists. He takes on a colorblind approach. He overemphasizes the class struggle as a feature of historical black leaders in the place of black liberation. Reed sees socialism as the solution to all problems. If a problem can't be solved by socialism, then it's not worthy of being solved. Reed deconstructs black politics into two categories: symbolism and a class struggle. For him, racism is just a cover story for class warfare.
Everybody sentient at this point, just about, is a product at a minimum of the sensibilities, right, around race and gender and sexual orientation, though ironically, or though, I mean, that only tended to proliferate later, that came out of the New Left, right? There's nobody except, hands full of sectarians or cranks, someplace, who argue that there's no such thing as racism, or that race and gender are epiphenomenal to building the working class movement, right? Blah, blah, blah. But the fact of the matter is, the dominant tendencies in left politics now have always given, I wouldn't necessarily say pride of place, but have always been conscious of the dynamics of race and gender that have historically, in some ways, if not undercut, at least impeded, right? The struggle to build a left politics in the U.S. and or that race and gender are epiphenomenal to building the working class movement, right? Blah, blah, blah.
The dynamics of race and gender undercut, impeded the left politics in the U.S. And
Adolph Reed is a hypocrite. He's a class reductionist that uses his black skin to shield himself from claims of being a class reductionist, but that's exactly what he is. He can't help himself. If you listen to him long enough, he will get to a point where he's trying to downplay race, and he's trying to make every issue in regards to race about class.
Would you please stop? Sir, I'm asking you to stop.
Please don't come close to me.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to me.
I'm taking a picture and calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
Excuse me? I'm sorry, I'm in the Ramble, and there is a man, African-American, he has a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African-American man, I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. And my... I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the Ramble. Please send the cops immediately.
And Professor, you mentioned Amy Cooper, and we covered on the show today that, outrageous moment in the park where she is confronted by an African-American man named Christian about her having her dog off the leash, and she sort of melts down instantly and says, I'm going to call the police and say an African-American man is threatening me, and then proceeds to do exactly that, feigning all kinds of hysterics in the process. I mean, what did you make of that particular moment, and what are the sort of broader implications of it?
Okay, I had a few thoughts. One is, both their surnames are Cooper, and for all I know, they're related.
I think we've reached a point where white people aren't even trying to bullshit us about what we are seeing in these videos anymore. But here goes our brother. He sees that video, and these are his first thoughts. This is someone that is supposed to be racially conscious. And this is how he interprets the video.
That's one thought. Second thought is that I saw on somebody's Twitter feed, and I thought about this too, that, the tweet made a joke of it. I just noted it, that she strained to be politically correct and call him an African-American man.
Yeah, that's right. This is all jokes for him. It's all a way to make fun of, I guess, political correctness, and is that, I don't know. Did you watch that video? Was that an issue for you as a black person? Did you see that and you think, oh wow, she called him an African American? Did that part even stick out to you? Did you really even give a fuck about that part? Were you more concerned about her calling the police to have this man executed? The fuck is this man talking about? What the fuck is wrong with this motherfucker? Oh, but he's not stupid. He knows exactly what we saw.
He strained to be politically correct and call him an African-American man, as you
Right.
calling on the cops to come kill him.
Calling on the cops to come kill him. Cops come kill him.
And the third thing is wondering whether she should have been disciplined and lost her job for it. And I thought that was kind of interesting too. Nobody's ever going to ask me to make the decision, so I don't really have to have a serious opinion about it, except it strikes me yet again at how consistent, maybe as much as anybody outside the public sector that's not under Republican control anyway, how serious the leading lights of the financial sector are about their commitments to diversity. It's really extraordinary.
Oh, you thought it was over? Just wait for this shit.
It was kind of striking to me that they fired her. If she'd been a line worker at a poultry plant, I would argue they shouldn't have.
It was kind of striking to me that they fired her. If she'd been a line worker at a poultry plant, I would argue they shouldn't have.
Since she was a management type in an investment banking firm, I couldn't care less.
Yeah, that's right. So it was a joke. Then he acknowledged how serious the situation was somewhere in the middle of that joke. And in the conclusion, he comes away with, if this woman was, I guess, a working class white woman, he would be against firing her. So basically, she set up somebody to be executed, and he would have defended her on the basis of working class solidarity.
From the 30s through the end of the 60s, a consistent position on the part, well, at least ironically after Black Power, a consistent position on the part of key figures on the left edge of the civil rights movement was that a redistributive program and social or expansion of the social state and expansion of the trade union sector were essential sine qua non for the advancement of Black Americans' rights, because Black Americans would, for a variety of reasons, disproportionately likely to be workers and poor people and so forth and so on.
What were those variety of reasons, and why won't you talk about them? That context is very important. And yes, black leaders have pushed for these socialistic positions because they do believe in wealth redistribution and programs for black people. Like, why are you skipping over that part? The part where all of them have been very specific about black liberation, very specific about righting the wrongs that have been done to black people.
What I'm calling radical democracy, because in the sense in which I'm building on elements of your earlier work, and I want to know now, later, how you define your sophisticated Pan-African view of the world with radical democracy.
But that kept me in trouble all the time because I had a 50-year direct relationship to the American Communist Party.
Right.
I would not let them take away my African partiality, my nationalism, and I would not let them stop me from criticizing them for their contradictions. Until finally they drove me out of the association of the party. I was never a member of the party, and yet I was closely related to many members and had more confidential information than most members, but I was never actually a member of the party. Briefly, I was a member of the Young Communist League on the Lower East Side, but I read more and did more work and defended the right of the party to exist and traveled in Russia several times, and I think the experiment in communism deserves a fair chance to exist. I think the Russians made a mess out of it and turned to capitalism. And Russia is now doing what she was criticizing England and the United States and the imperial powers for doing. Literally killing our own people. There was some discrimination in Russia against Africans, and many Africans taking Russian women home was found dead on snow piles in Russia.
It's interesting to me, as you pointed out, that the demand that you hear most often coming from, the sort of black thought leaders that you see on television, that you see online, is that Biden nominate a black VP. And the folks that have been offered up most consistently are Stacey Abrams and Kamala Harris, who essentially are ideologically very much in line with Joe Biden. So there's no expectation, yes, personnel is policy, but it doesn't seem to me that there's any expectation that either of those individuals as vice president would change or shape or shift what a Biden administration would ultimately do vis-a-vis the black community. How does that fixation on representation over a policy agenda, how does that impact, how does that ultimately undermine the African American community?
Now, on the face of this does appear to be a good question, except for the fact that black thought leaders is a vast category. And no, this is not the totality of what black thought leaders are pushing for at this point in time. Even Adolph Reed knows that that's not the case. But let's see how he deals with this question. Is he going to expand on black politics to talk about the totality of perspectives? Or is he going to also minimize black politics and push for a class solution?
Well, see, that's why I say that I'm insisting that the black vote is a fiction, right? And I would also insist, not quite as strongly, but that the notion of the African American community is a similar fiction. And it's a useful fiction. It's a useful fiction. It's a fiction that's useful in the way that all nationalisms are useful, in that it functions as a perfume over what's a class-skewed agenda. Again, like this, so-called thought leaders, which I think is a very polite and genteel way to put it, are people who have a class investment in this kind of politics, and it's a politics of racial brokerage, and it's got nothing at all to do with the things that the vast majority of black Americans who get up in the morning think about. right? Because they get up in the morning thinking about how to pay the mortgage, how to pay the rent.
Yep, he denied the existence of the black vote. He denied the existence of a black community and said it's really all a class issue. And part of what he does is he takes the fact that black people are largely in poverty and he puts that into an argument without any context of why they are largely in that poverty, just to justify a socialistic perspective. Now, when you take into context why black people are largely in poverty, you have to look at the government's actions in sabotaging black efforts to succeed. And if you are looking at that, then ultimately you're going to have to draw a conclusion that maybe the government needs to do something for black people to make up for what it did to harm black people. But Reed does not want to have that discussion. He wants to sidestep that discussion. So it's very easy for him to repackage issues about black people paying their mortgage or rent into just a neat little class warfare scenario.
Yeah, I mean, and among the ways that the class divides are consequential are, for instance, the current obsession with the New Deal as racist, right? And with the idea of that universal programs, right, are fundamentally racist because they don't target black people in particular.
No, Adolph Reed, the argument is that universal policies don't address the disparities.
And black people don't get anything out of it. But the fact of the matter is that black people got a lot out of the GI Bill.
Our guest at the beginning of the show, you know, I pointed out that Ferguson and many other black enclaves are A, poor, and B, black, in part because of the way the GI Bill was administered. And he said, well, give me some numbers to prove that. And I didn't have them at my fingertips, so here they are. The GI Bill, first of all, it was $95 billion worth of programs, which is, you know, a fair amount of money. I mean, it's less than a tenth of what George Bush spent in Iraq, but it's still a hell of a lot of money. 16 million veterans attended college or bought homes or received job training as a result of the GI Bill. Bill Clinton once called it the best deal ever made by Uncle Sam. However, the congressional leaders, when they wrote the GI Bill, they made sure that the money didn't come, like when my dad, for example, used the GI Bill to buy a house in Lansing, Michigan. My dad was part of the occupation of Japan after World War II, but when he joined and went through basic training, the war was still going on. And so he qualified for the GI Bill. And when Dad did that, the money, it wasn't like Washington, D.C. wrote a check or backstopped the loan that my dad got for that house. Instead, or for that matter, when my dad went to college, the money was given to the state of Michigan, and state officials administered the funds. So as a historian by the name of Katznelson writes, written under, in quote, written under Southern auspices, the law was deliberately designed to accommodate Jim Crow. It was as though the GI Bill had been earmarked for white veterans only. Southern congressional leaders made certain that the programs were directed not by Washington, but by local white officials, businessmen, bankers, and college administrators who would honor past practices. So, numbers. Our guest was saying, give me numbers. Let's just take a look at the state of Mississippi, for example, in one year, 1947. There were 3,229 loans to purchase a home, a business, or a farm under the GI Bill in Mississippi in 1947. 3,229. How many went to black veterans? 2. There's your numbers.
and that racial disparity isn't in the distribution of benefits and bad, good things and bad things, isn't necessarily like the end of the story, right? There's a lot more that's at stake.
Is captured in the phrase that Ta-Nehisi quotes in his recent book, and before that James Baldwin, those who would be white. They create a notion of a sanctuary,
yes,
where you're not subject in a fantasy life to those deprivations and the anxieties of the prospect of those deprivations.
Well, I think he calls them the dreamers.
Yes.
And he does that because they are constructing a fantasy.
Yes.
And that fantasy makes it extremely difficult for us to address our most pressing social problems.
Yes. Now, when we look at the evidence across the spectrum, education, health, employment, housing finance, ownership, entrepreneurship, we don't see something like traditional economic theory, where you and I were educated, which is what I call a whiteboard and a just world outcome based only on your talent, your ability, your preparation, your stamina.
Right.
You see outcomes that are systematically detrimental to the African American population.
So you may have seen this report already that a team of us did, including Derek Hamilton at the New School, called "Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain."
Yes.
I think that report encapsulates the false narrative that has emerged out of much of traditional economics. Because one of the standard kinds of claims that emerges from traditional economics is the view that if we could improve the human capital of the group that has less, which usually means raising their educational attainment, then we can eliminate or close these kinds of gaps or disparities that we observe that are economic in character. But in Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain, we demonstrate, for example, that blacks who have completed a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of whites who never finished high school.
Yes.
So it's transparent that additional education is not adequate to close the racial wealth gap. But moreover, if we compare blacks who have finished some college with whites who never finished high school, blacks who have finished some college have a higher unemployment rate than whites who dropped out of high school. And to compound that, if we look at unemployment rates at each level of education, blacks consistently have unemployment rates that are 2 times as high as whites. So there is not a payoff, an adequate payoff in terms of improved employment opportunities that's associated with additional education sufficient to close those gaps either. So these disparities have to be rooted in other kinds of practices, and I would say that one of the central ones is discrimination in employment. And then another major factor is the whole process of how we transfer wealth from one generation to the next through inheritances, through gifts and the like. Communities that have families that have more resources are better able to transfer those resources to the next generation. And this applies fully or strongly when we start thinking about racial inequality with respect to wealth, because black families on average have considerably less to be able to give to the next generation in the way of inheritances or gifts.
But this notion that Medicare for all, right, like a single-payer healthcare system wouldn't do anything for black people because it's not race-targeted. The idea that free public college wouldn't do anything for black people because it's not race-targeted.
No, that's not the argument. The argument is that if there's a racial disparity, doing a universal policy will not address that racial disparity. So if black people are largely on the bottom of every statistic that there is, okay, now that you give me free health care, I'm still on the bottom, Nah, I just have health care. If you give me free education, I'm still on the bottom. Nah, I just have an education. But in every other way, I'm on the bottom. So, like, if we're talking about a disparity between the races, and you're talking about a solution that will essentially change the bottom for everyone, all you're doing is adding a level of comfort to the bottom, but you're not actually moving black people who are at the bottom rung of this society from that bottom rung to another rung. And that's what we're looking for. That's what we're trying to achieve, because we're in this situation largely because we had a government that was sabotaging us. So our politics is going to revolve around trying to get the government to fix what it has done. If you want to ignore what the government has done, what exactly makes you different than a conservative on the right? Let's be honest. If you have the same conclusion as the people that you tell me are my enemies, then how the fuck do I see you as a friend?
And I mean, so and of course, free college. I mean, we've had one of our financial editor, Sparky Abraham, has written about the way that student debt, because student debt is disproportionately held by people of color, free college actually is something that disproportionately benefits people of color, because they're the ones that are screwed over most by the way we finance college.
Let's talk about this hustle stat real quick. When someone is talking to you about something so broad like a universal program, but they're coming back to you with the benefits of something that is so specific to your issue, you have to wonder, what aren't they telling you? So why are we talking about debt? Now, I get why we would talk about debt in certain discussions, but if we're talking about universal free college, then that is not necessarily the only discussion to be had. We would also have to talk about people who aren't necessarily in poverty, who won't have to pay for college anymore. You know, people who do have wealth. And if we're not eating into their wealth with an expense like college, that means they'll be more likely to have that wealth at the end of their 4 years, 8 years, or whatever, how many ever years. Now, we can debate whether or not there's an element of fairness in making people pay if they can pay, or if they have the wealth to pay, I should say. But to me, that is irrelevant in describing a situation when we're trying to deal with a disparity. And this is a solution that they use to deal with the disparity. So we have to be honest about what this will do. If we're just talking about free college for everyone, this will benefit white people more just by looking at the percentage of people that are going to college. But you wouldn't know that if we only limited the discussion down to debt. Like, this is the trick that they're pulling.
And I was kind of blown away to get back and find out that the reparations issue had popped up and had gone live and was all over C-SPAN and everything. I couldn't figure out where it came from.
Of course, he's not happy about reparations popping up in the news.
And I couldn't figure out what was going on, seeing like respectable professors on judicious panels talking about this issue. Because my question was always, first question I said this to Kianga too, has always been the same, and I've never gotten what I think is a satisfactory attempt to answer it even, right? Which is, how can you imagine in a majoritarian democracy putting together a political alliance that's capable of prevailing on an issue like this that nobody gets anything out of except black people?
All right, Adolph Reed, here's the argument. There are less than 15 million union workers in the United States of America. There are 70,000 DSA members, I don't see where you guys find the numbers to push your agenda. And when I look at the political history of the Socialist Party in the United States of America, it's a fucking joke. Right now, we have seen the farthest that a socialist has gone in the example of Bernie Sanders, and he was defeated twice because of the black vote. There are 36 million African Americans in this country that descend from American chattel slavery. If union workers, if the working class, if all these people that you think are in this thing of solidarity together could come together and push this thing so that black people in this country that descend from American bondage can have justice, you will always find support for lefty policies in the black vote.
And that's even before all of the other questions, like what counts as reparations. I mean, who gets what? I mean, should the ADOS, the American Descendants of Slaves line be followed?
Okay, you are familiar with ADOS's language as far as eligibility is concerned, and I agree with it. I think it's the most logical qualifications that I've seen. If you have any disagreement with that, you probably should have let that be known. Otherwise, I think we should defer to Dr. William Darity. He is an economist who has basically been studying this issue for decades, and he wrote a book basically about the history of reparations, the justifications, the reasons why, and how it can be done.
I do think that just from a pragmatic political point of view, the pragmatic political question trumps it, right? And I know the response has always been, well, but don't you think black people deserve something? And I said, well, yeah, of course, but that's not the issue, right? The issue is what is possible to win and how you can win it. But it even gets more, and maybe we can pursue this, but I think that's also fundamentally more of a class program than it is a racial program.
Yes. Where would we be without a pivot to class? But I wonder, what happens if you don't give in and you just argue some more with Adolph Reed?
Well, can I ask you, though, what you think? Because it strikes me that a lot of the things that we demand on the left are radical and require shifting public consciousness, and often at the beginning are things that we can't imagine, or it's very difficult to imagine happening, and the fact that the majority may be against you means that you have to work really, really hard, and it's a long, slow process. But that if that's what would constitute justice, it's sort of necessary, because I mean there are lots of things that majorities oppose, but we believe in protecting the minorities. So how do you think about things that are sort of practical utopianism versus things that are utopianism?
Yeah, but yeah, I hear you. And in fact, like to go back to the Marty Moss Cohen show, I mean, Kianga brought up the case of abolitionism. And that's a nice case because it shows the problem with the argument that abolitionism didn't get anywhere, really, except to piss off the slaveholders until political circumstances shifted to advance the position of political anti-slavery.
All right, to be clear, the question was, should we fight for reparations since it is the right thing to do as far as giving black people justice in this country? And did you see how he really didn't disprove the scenario that he was trying to use as, his point like, okay, so you're saying that they didn't get anywhere until the political situation changed. For the political situation to change, there already has to be an anti-slavery sentiment that people can grasp onto. And that's why there needs to be a movement fighting for reparations so that people have something to grasp onto. Otherwise, you're just giving me a circular argument that doesn't really go anywhere. So why should I accept that?
I mean, do you think there are ever issues where you just have to say, well, I mean, is it ever possible to mobilize around something that is not in the self-interest of the, I mean, we don't want to always have to appeal to self-interest. There are things where we're going to have to pursue things where people are going to have to give something up.
Well, look, I mean, my take on this is that, so like I read Aesop's Fables a lot when I was a little kid. And my favorite one, well, one of my favorite ones, was the one about the contest between the wind and the sun. They were boasting back and forth at each other, and they determined to test their prowess against a wayfarer who was walking along the road, and whichever one could get him to take his coat off would be the more powerful. So the wind blew and blew and blew, and no matter how much harder the wind blew, like I mean, the traveler just kind of pulled his coat more and more tightly around himself. And then when the sun took its turn, right, it just sort of began to radiate more and more warmth. And the traveler eventually took the coat off on his own. My approach to politics, and this goes back to the question of what counts as a movement and what doesn't, is the project of trying to fasten a broad-based political alliance in which different people and constituencies can not only see a vehicle for pursuing their own interests, but can come to understand that a condition for advancement of their own interests is equal commitment to advancement of their partner's interests.
Cool story, bro. You've been in this like what, 30 years? Where is your broad-based alliance? I do not see it anywhere. And yes, he did just explain that he bases his political philosophy on a fairy tale.
Does that mean that the black-white wealth gap is sort of inevitable then, or is there something that can address that particular?
Well, yeah, and that's a good question too. I just saw a recent study by a guy named Apparatus and his colleagues that argues in a seemingly persuasive way that actually the root of the wealth gap is fundamentally the income gap.
Okay, so I've actually been trying to find this study that he's mentioning. It's obviously hard because he doesn't name the actual study. He doesn't even name colleagues of Apparatus. So I can't find this study. But I would love to read it because it seems very odd to me that someone would make a claim like that, especially since the wealth gap is significantly more than the income gap. So this is not just, it doesn't add up. So it doesn't make sense to me.
Right, and what's interesting about that is that well, in the first place, like the argument seems plausible, although I'm having difficulty reconstructing it in my head off the top of my head.
This part is kind of important. If you're going to cite a study, you kind of need to, like, if you don't know the name of the study, at least know what they are arguing. Like, what? Okay. So this is his level of argumentation under pressure. Like, this is what he brings to the table to kind of Like, all right, if you're trying to sell me socialism on the idea that it's about justice, it's about inequality, and then when I bring to you, especially an issue like reparations that is about workers being paid, and like one of the greatest injustices around labor that has happened in America, and this is the level of argumentation that you're giving me, maybe you don't take it seriously. Maybe the Marxist rhetoric is just a lot of bullshit. I don't know. But this comes across like you're only talking to white workers, because I don't understand how you frame it in your mind that you're actually giving black people an argument that we can agree with and find solidarity in.
Had now, but they purport to show through experiments that if you close the income gap substantially, right, like at any given point, then the wealth gap that would take 500 years to close can be closed in like 30, right?
As far as this concept of we can reduce it from 500 to 30 years, that seems ridiculous. But the question then becomes, why would we accept a gap that would take 30 years to close? Shouldn't we solve that problem also? Like, just get it out the way.
Mm-hmm. Now the Al Apprentice study has been met with, I wouldn't say a firestorm, because there are no weapons, right, for the firestorm, but circumspection, because, you know, for predictable reasons. One of them is that people who study the wealth gap are committed to the wealth gap being causally meaningful.
That's right. He cannot describe the argument that he is making or that he is backing, but he is already poisoning the well for any critiques that you might find on this study that he didn't even name.
So, like, and just as academics, but I mean, also, you know, there's an embedded ideological vision that's sort of smuggled into the wealth gap construct, right? Like in this sense, what's the big penalty that comes from the wealth gap, right?
Oh shit! Tread lightly, brother. Don't go completely mask off.
The big penalty comes from limits of capital formation, right? And rich black people talk about this all the time. Well, okay, so then what would capital formation do? Well, capital or more repaired access to capital, right, comports with a political ideal of strict equality, real equality of opportunity being like the fundamental norm of social justice, right?
It might allow black people to participate in capitalism as capitalists, which is a problem for the Adolph Reed types. They don't want us to do that. They want us to embrace socialism. And I have no problem with black people who want to dabble in that ideology. But we got to be real here. You are offering me a theory. My real life is fucked up. And you're not even offering fix my situation in exchange for what you want to do. What you're offering is that in the hopes of you succeeding at what you're doing, that my situation would get better. Not fixed, but better. Yeah, we are looking for fixes, and your ideology is at odds with that. Just say that.
and it's like this difference that my good friend Preston Smith has harped on for a while now. There's a difference between the principles of a racial democracy and the principles of social democracy that existed in a state of de facto tension, right, in black politics from the 30s through the 60s and 70s. And I think kind of what we have here is like a conflict between two different ideals of social justice and two different ideals of social justice for black people, right? I mean, one of which hinges on overcoming unjust impediments to upward mobility, within American neoliberal capitalism, and the other of which is, frankly, socialist.
Overcoming unjust impediments to upward mobility, and the other of which is, frankly, socialist.
That is him clearly stating that he is in opposition to any justice for black people that is not within the framework of socialism. But there's an interesting thing about people like Adolph Reed. They tell on themselves. So let's double back real quick to a moment that I kind of skipped over because I wanted to make a more direct point about reparations.
Right. So from that perspective, and like this also connects with one of the sort of standard, almost pro forma beefs that I have about what's called identity politics, which is that I just don't understand. I've said this for more than 30 years too, how we build solidarity by going around the room to stress how profoundly we actually differ from one another.
Now, mind you, he reduces black issues down to identity politics, which also means in his mind tokenism. So this is in the middle of him answering the question about reparations. But I think it's interesting that he felt so adamant about people distinguishing themselves in the group when he's talking about an issue in regards to benefiting black people. But he felt differently, or he had a different perspective about this type of thing in this other clip.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
Well, it's Biden, right? I mean, it's part and parcel of his, working class everyman friend of MBNA image.
So all this talk about solidarity with the working class, and this is what is going on in his mind, Adolph Reed's mind, when he thinks about the working man image. This is how the working man thinks, according to Adolph Reed, and this is who we should have solidarity with. We can bring up our differences in the meeting, but apparently we aren't black if we don't support them. Now look at our brother Adolph Reed, the man who has never met a class reductionist, has no clue where these people could be. Watch him downplay the black vote, hit you with some mumbo jumbo, and then twist this right back into a class discussion.
Or that he's cultivated. It's consistent with his entire record and self-presentation, especially during the 2020 primaries. I mean, look, the problem with taking something called the black vote for granted is, first of all, the notion of the black vote, right? Because the idea of the black vote is really the expression of a sort of calcified interest group politics agenda that's very sharply class skewed.
Class skewed. Class skewed.
I'm sure it's not 100% a myth. As Cicero said, I don't know, that's the most pretentious possible way to start a sentence, but as Cicero said, there's no view so absurd it has not been advocated by some philosopher, so I'm sure you can find somebody to point me to who's a real serious, genuine class reductionist, but Adolph Reed, as I think that makes clear, is certainly not a class reductionist. So why were people accusing him of this? Well, part of it has to do with a larger strategic difference between how the sorts of demands that Reed thinks that the left should focus on and try to reach out to people with versus, what some other people think. And part of it has to do with the specific subject of the lecture that he was going to give. So this lecture was about the COVID pandemic and racial disparity ideology. So if you want to know what that means, you can find. So this is Adolph Reed, Disparity Ideology, Coronavirus, and the Danger of the Return of Racial Medicine, where he's talking about a couple of related things. One of them is the emphasis. The overarching subject is the way that a lot of liberal or even leftist, social democratic politicians have been really emphasizing the racial disparities in COVID deaths, that, black people, brown people are vastly more likely to die of COVID than white people. And that's true and important. But Reed is, of course, not denying that it's true or important or disturbing. Reed has been spending his entire life as a critic of racism and capitalism. So obviously he's not going to say that.
This has been Burgess. He's a logic professor and he's also a YouTube lefty. But most importantly, he is full of shit. You need to go read this article by Adolph Reed. Reed is not only denying that more black people are dying, he's denying the importance of looking into a racial disparity.
What he is saying is that front-loading the racial disparity per se and not really talking about the mechanism is dangerous, he thinks, for a couple of reasons. One is that it might give people the impression that this is some sort of, there's some sort of genetic explanation for these disparities, which of course would be, that's what he means when he talks about the return of racial medicine. And of course his point there is that since race is silly made up bullshit, it's not a meaningful natural genetic category, it's a social construction, then so we want to look elsewhere for the cause of these disparities. Well, what's the cause of these disparities? The cause of these disparities, as he points out, is very simple, right? That certainly, there might be other exacerbating factors that cause the disparities, but the overwhelming factor is that due to the horrifying racial history of the United States, black and brown people are more likely to live in poverty.
Reed makes absolutely no connection in that article between the racial history of America and the poverty that black people face today. In fact, what he does in that article is kind of deny that there's a racial element at all, because he implies that racism was essentially fixed with the social movements of the 60s.
Due to the horrifying racial history of the United States, black and brown people are more likely to live in poverty than white people. And this statistical fact in turn drives the ones about COVID deaths, because there are all sorts of ways in which living in poverty makes you more likely to be vulnerable to this, ranging from you don't have the kind of job where you can work from home to healthcare access, to, etc. Right? All right. So the other reason he thinks that it's important to emphasize the poverty causing disproportionate deaths rather than emphasizing the racial distribution of the deaths, which can sort of mask the fact that the underlying issue is the racial distribution of poverty.
All right, several times I asked you to go to this Adolph Reed article, and what I want you to do is click on this link to this other article that he's actually referencing as far as a reason for his article. The problem here is that Adolph Reed is so against acknowledging a racial disparity that he is way beyond the point of straw manning his opposition. What Reed is doing now is straight up conspiracy theory. And it is sad to see anyone try to defend this man at this point in time, because you can click on this article, read through it, and see it is nothing like how he describes it. He is saying that Democratic leaders, academics, reporters, medical professionals were asking for information on a racial disparity for this COVID thing because they secretly believe in some type of eugenic type of mindset. When in reality, people were bringing this up because of the existing racial disparities in healthcare. Like, they were bringing it up because they already knew the limited access that black people have to healthcare. They already knew the higher level of pre-existing conditions that exist among black people. They were bringing this stuff up because they knew about the racial wealth gap. And they knew about the de facto segregation that was going on in these communities. That's not something that can be explained away through poverty. You can't see that through poverty. This is something that Reed will not address. He only wants to see things through the lens of poverty. He only wants to see things through the lens of class. So he took something that was perfectly reasonable and he made a monster out of it.
I think they're basically a debater's trick, right? And it's one that's common enough, like in academic life as well as elsewhere. You attribute to an unnamed opponent an extreme stance that no actual people take, and then you tear down substantive arguments by linking them to this extreme fiction that you've posited, but that nobody really embraces. I mean,
can you explain the actual point and why this narrow emphasis on just racial disparities over potentially has certain pitfalls as it relates to COVID-related deaths, and actually might hurt us in the attempt to actually undermine the disparities that is leading to the deaths disproportionately of many poor people and many of Black and brown.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll try to be concise about this. I mean, the problem is that racism doesn't explain anything, right?
This is Reed months later after statistics from all over the country have proven him wrong about there being a racial disparity in the COVID infections. 2 months from his article, enough time for him and his supporters to go back and read past the headlines of all those articles that he referenced in his little article. You know, all those articles that supposedly caused the alarm to begin with. You can read those articles and see that all of it is bullshit. And it's fucking sad that he is given a platform where he can downplay racism and then push a conspiracy theory just so he can derail any type of discussion about race.
It's a label that we put on to more complex dynamics and processes of exploitation and oppression. But racism itself, or the charge of racism itself, should always be followed by, when I say this is an instance of racism, I mean these features of it show racist dispositions, attitudes, the impact of racist structures, or whatever.
And that's exactly what people did in all of those articles.
But so what's happened with disparity discourse, and for some time now, because Namerlin Chalkwanian and I did an article in the Socialist Register on the limits of disparities discourse eight years ago, for God's sake. Pointing to disparities doesn't explain anything, right? Like it doesn't, it's an alternative to a causal account, right? Because you say, see, disparity, racism, but you don't have a causal account of how the inequalities are produced, right? So that's one problem, right? Like it doesn't help you get anywhere, is that problem.
The causal account is centuries of discriminatory laws that has created a racial wealth gap and has created a situation where black people have less access to health care because of that gap. And in every article, you could see people explaining this over and over and over again. But Adolph Reed is pretending that that part does not exist, because that part disproves everything he's trying to do.
Another problem is that, and we've seen this already now, I mean, this time around, that the ways that people talk about race in this country and wherever they talk about it are so hopelessly confused and knee-jerk and abstract and, you know, and incoherent, that when you say, I mean, you and I can say that race matters. Charles Murray can say that race matters. And I assume you and I aren't going to mean the same thing that Charles Murray means, but there are enough Charles Murray types out there, even who don't think of themselves as Charles Murray types.
Who is Adolph Reed talking about? Because if you look at his article, he's pointing to people like Elizabeth Warren. He's pointing to AOC. He's pointing to Charles Blow from the New York Times. And like, who now he's saying that they think of race in the same way that Charles Murray thinks of race. Like, how are y'all falling for this scam?
Who would think, who have already indicated that the persistent and what seem to be large, although as the total cases go up, the disparities can flatten out, disparate impact on Black and brown people with respect to the bad outcomes or the worst outcomes from COVID-19 infection are signs of, are evidence or stem from differential racial biology. So that's one problem, right?
Who the fuck is he talking about?
That's lurking there. But it doesn't have to be a biological metaphor. Yes, I mean, when the biological metaphor is invoked, right, I and I assume a lot of the rest of us, you know, think about that cattle train that ends up at Auschwitz, right? Because that's where that narrative always goes.
Yes, this is Alex Jones level. We went from politicians, journalists, academics requesting data on racial disparities, and now he is making them out to be like some type of Nazis who are going to lead us to a Holocaust.
But it can also be cultural, right? Because race wasn't, I mean, race was always, well, race can't denote anything that's empirically real because the concept is an abstraction, like it's not real. I mean, I like the way that my son, the birthday boy, did this his last piece in Jacobin, where he invoked Christianity. He said, look, Christians believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. Jesus Christ doesn't have to be the literal Son of God for Christianity to be real and have force in the world, right? Even not taking into account all the billions of Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and whatever the hell else who don't embrace the belief that Jesus is the Son of God, right? But race exists because of racism, right? As Barbara Fields has argued also. It's a cover story, right? To sustain a particular technology of hierarchy, right? Exploitation and oppression. So it's not really dependent on biology in the way that people like to think it is. And in fact, part of the story of post-war American ideology and the crafting of post-war liberalism and the social sciences is that the Holocaust in particular had made the notion of biological race had put heavy negative sanctions on it, like at least outside the South in the U.S.
Yes, the racial hierarchy. Anyways, you notice how he constantly makes like these go nowhere points. Like, what was the point about race and Christianity? Like, okay, yeah, we get it. Like race is a social construct, but we live in a society that acknowledges race. So let's deal with the reality of the society that we live in and stop playing games.
So the effective race idea moves from biology to culture. And in this context, then, it's the easiest thing in the world, and I think we have both, and we aren't alone in having done so, we have both seen articles asserting softer or stronger versions of this claim that Blacks and Latinos are more likely to suffer the consequences because they're more likely to have the underlying comorbidity conditions, and they're more likely to have those because of their shitty habits, right, with eating and whatnot. And therefore, focusing on the racial disparity doesn't even get people to where they think it's going to get them, right?
Who is Adolph Reed talking about? What is Adolph Reed talking about? I think you should be able to see the point. But he is going to use this imaginary enemy, and I mean, well, you're going to see he goes full mask off.
Right. And one question that I would have to ask at this point, I mean, we already were asking it 8 years ago, if the focus on racial disparity has been so unsuccessful in getting people who are purportedly committed to social change where they want to go, what's so sweet about continuing to focus on the racial disparity?
What's so sweet about continuing to focus on the racial disparity? Racial disparity.
What does it do for you that's satisfactory, other than since it doesn't get you to where it is you're trying to go?
So